Excelente español. Ninguna queja. Ahora, un placer para mí presentarles a la doctora Ellen Warner. Ella es médica oncóloga en el Centro de Ciencias de la Salud de Summit Group en Toronto, profesora de medicina en la Universidad de Toronto en Canadá. La doctora Ellen Warner realizó sus estudios en la Escuela de Medicina de la Universidad de Toronto y terminó sus estudios médicos y su especialización en radiación oncológica en Jerusalén, en Israel. Ellen Warner obtuvo una maestría en epidemiología clínica por la Universidad de Toronto también. Su práctica y líneas de investigación están enfocadas de manera completa en el manejo de la mujer con cáncer de mama o en alto riesgo de padecer la enfermedad. En 1994 empezó el primer programa de pruebas genéticas en mujeres con cáncer de mama y una historia familiar sugerente de alguna mutación. En 1997 lideró un estudio demostrando que la adición de la resonancia magnética a la mamografía para realizar tamizaje en mujeres de 30 años o más con una predisposición genética inherente a desarrollar cáncer de mama es mucho más sensible que realizar únicamente la mamografía. Este estudio logró para 2011, con financiamiento del gobierno canadiense, que se estableciera un programa de detección de cáncer de mama con un estudio por resonancia magnética y mamografía para mujeres con muy alto riesgo en Ontario, la provincia más grande de Canadá. Basada en los resultados observados durante su estudio de tamizaje sobre las necesidades especiales que tienen las mujeres jóvenes diagnosticadas con cáncer, en 2008, la doctora Warner lanzó el programa para mujeres jóvenes con cáncer de mama y un programa de investigación clínica y educacional especializado enfocado en mujeres de 40 años o menos con cáncer de mama, el cual ahora le da servicio a más de 250 mujeres jóvenes. Este programa provee apoyo personalizado a pacientes y sus familias desde el momento que se les diagnostica con cáncer de mama y a través del tratamiento activo y de seguimiento. Es el único programa de su tipo en Canadá y está financiado enteramente por donaciones privadas. La doctora Warner es también co-investigadora de un programa de subvención de 6 millones financiado parcialmente por la Fundación Canadiense de Cáncer de Mama y el Instituto Canadiense de Investigación en Salud, cuya extensión abarca la totalidad de Canadá y se enfoca en las necesidades especiales de la mujer joven con cáncer de mama y es investigadora principal de un subproyecto enfocado en aspectos de fertilidad en esta población. Muchas gracias, doctora.
Thank you for that kind and elaborate introduction. I'm going to apologize for speaking in English. My command of Spanish is limited to "Donde está el baño, por favor?", which doesn't get you very far in the talk, except which it'll be. Pink is the only program in Canada, and unfortunately still one of the only programs in the world dedicated specifically to women diagnosed with breast cancer at age 40 or younger. I've divided its goals arbitrarily into 4, but there's really a lot of overlap. And it's similar to the program you heard about before in many ways. We want to optimize breast cancer care, meaning maximize survival with minimum morbidity. We want to offer support to the patients and families, education and research. As you heard before, we're funded entirely by donations. We specifically avoided turning to the pharmaceutical industry, not because I think that they're going to bias our care, but because we want to avoid any perception of that kind of bias. So over the years, many people have turned to me and said, why do we need a program like PINK? And that includes many experienced oncologists. For one thing, at least in Canada and the United States, almost 95% of breast cancer is diagnosed in women over the age of 40. And people will say, well, besides, those few younger women who get breast cancer, aren't they healthier or stronger and more able to tolerate treatment? What do they need special attention for? And that's exactly what I thought until something happened 10 years ago. And that was when I attended the annual San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium with a colleague of mine. And I remember we looked at the last session, which was a half-day session, and we thought, oh my God, what a waste. It looks so boring. It's about young women with breast cancer. Let's just skip it and go do something fun like shopping. Well, it turned out that it was raining that day and we decided to stay in, and that simple decision changed the course of my work forever. Because what we learned at that session were three things, which to you are going to seem very, very obvious today, but 10 years ago they weren't so obvious to most people. First of all, as a group, cancers in these women are different. They're generally diagnosed at a later stage, they have more aggressive biology, and both these things contribute to a disproportionate number of deaths from cancer in this population. And then more often due to hereditary factors like VRC mutation, which adds a whole layer of complexity to their management. We also learned that these women have more, not fewer, side effects than their older counterparts, related to that early, sudden, severe menopause, and to infertility, which is common even in women who continue to menstruate after treatment. And we learned about the many increased psychosocial problems compared to their older counterparts, seen in every single study, not only short-term and during treatment, but many, many years later. And you've heard about many of the reasons for these psychosocial problems today: body image, sexual dysfunction, severe disruption of intimate relationships, and phobias about dating. Women with small children have severe practical issues with looking after their children during treatment. And of course, those without treatment worry, will they ever have future children? And all these women worry, am I going to live long enough to raise these children to adulthood? Breast cancer disrupts education, and it can permanently ruin careers and budding businesses, which is only one of the reasons many of these women have severe financial problems. These breast cancer patients feel isolated from their healthy friends who are building families and building careers and not worrying about menopause and death. But they also feel just as isolated from other breast cancer patients who tend to be the same age as their mothers and grandmothers. So when my colleague and I heard all this, we turned to each other and together said, we have to have a special program for these women at Sunnybrook. And that's where the idea of PINK was born. The first thing we did when we got back to Toronto was search the literature on the web to see if there were any similar programs anywhere in the world so we wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. We found absolutely nothing. But we did find something interesting. There was a Canadian study that had just been published called Nothing Fit Me, and its goals were to look at the unmet needs of young Canadian women with breast cancer. And the investigators did something very ambitious. They ran 10 focus groups across the country of women diagnosed at age 45 or younger. Now bear in mind that Canada is a larger country in area than the United States, but with only 1/10 the population. And what they found, despite how vast Canada is, that there were very consistent themes in the unmet needs of the women. They found they wanted more information, particularly about subjects relevant to young women, such as sexuality and breast reconstruction. They wanted extra support for themselves and their partners. And they wanted someone to navigate through the complicated sea of specialists who didn't necessarily talk to each other, tests and treatments. And what we realized is the only way we were going to be able to fulfill these unmet needs would be to hire a special dedicated nurse who would be only working with these women. And so our PINK nurse had to become an information and resource specialist. There are actually a lot of resources in the community for these young women which we didn't even know about until this nurse started to look for them and find them and collect them. She would provide individualized and group support to these women. And she would be a navigator, not only to coordinate all the appointments, but also to offer continuity of care, right from the time of diagnosis, through treatment, and through follow-up. Care that's normally very fragmented, unfortunately, for our breast cancer patients. And the challenge for the nurse was to deliver the right care at the right point in time for these patients. together an executive with representatives from medical, radiation, and surgical oncology, nursing, and psychology. But the most important people on our executive were young women who were breast cancer survivors. These were women who had been diagnosed with breast cancer before age 40, and they were thrilled to hear that we were going to put together a program that they only wished they would have had when they were going through treatment. So we had several initial hurdles to overcome. The first was to convince our colleagues of the need for such a program. They were really skeptical. And the second issue was, should we have only a small number of oncologists treating these patients so that the patients could all be in one or two clinics and see each other, they'd see other young women in the waiting room, and the nurse wouldn't have to run around all week to all these different breast cancer clinics. That made a whole lot more sense to us. But unfortunately, we did too good a job convincing our colleagues about what a fascinating group of patients they were, and they all wanted now to look after young breast cancer patients. So they wouldn't give them up to us. So of course we now have the nurse running around to 9 or 10 clinics every week, and the patients are pretty much spread out in all of them. Although I tend to do all my patients until Monday morning, the clinic I call the Pink Clinic, which I'll tell you a bit more about. One of the biggest hurdles was actually choosing an appropriate name. A lot of time went into that. And we chose pink because you may have noticed the color pink seems to now represent breast cancer in almost every country in the world. And we changed the spelling from I to Y, Y standing for young. But pink is not an acronym. People are shocked to hear that. The other big hurdle was funding. We managed to convince the people who ran our cancer center of the importance of pink. They thought it was a magnificent idea, but they weren't willing to give us 1 cent. They said, how can we? We're cutting other programs. How can we invest in a new program? And to add insult to injury, they were insisting that we don't hire just a regular nurse. We had to hire a very expensive advanced practice nurse because this was part of their political agenda. Well, we were almost ready to give up, but not our survivors. They rose to the challenge and they put on a beautiful fundraising event that raised enough money for us to hire a part-time nurse 3 days a week for an entire year. And so we were able to launch Pink 3 years after the concept started in February 2008. And we've been steadily accruing approximately 1 patient per week. Within 2.5 years, we had overcome the capacity of a part-time nurse, and at this point we were able to hire a full-time, regular, wonderful nurse, who costs the same actually as the part-time advanced practice nurse. We now have more than 250 patients who've enrolled in the program. I'm a little humbled. It's not nearly like the one at Harvard, but this is Canada, and it's a little bit smaller. And our youngest patient is 17 years old. Our executive continues to meet every month, and now it's a social worker and a research assistant. But our survivor volunteers continue to be the most active and the most passionate members of our group. So I'd like to go through each of the goals of Pink and describe some of the initiatives we've taken so far in each one. Obviously, optimizing breast cancer care is a huge initiative, and what we decided to tackle was that area in which we thought we were performing the most poorly. And that was the area of fertility. And we heard a wonderful talk today about fertility and by Matteo and Bettina. But as you probably know, ASCO now has firm recommendations that every single young cancer patient should have a discussion about fertility initiated by their healthcare provider as early as possible. Well, we weren't doing this at all. The only patients who were getting referred for fertility preservation were patients who specifically were asking us about it. So we had a long way to go. And here's what we did. The first thing we did is we invited fertility experts to come to our hospital and give us a talk, like you heard this morning, about the importance of fertility preservation in these patients and about the successes of the new techniques. And we also invited invited them to come talk to us as a group and give us more information about costs and some of the nitty-gritty details, how long it would take, and so forth. And then we created a policy that we were going to discuss fertility with every single one of our young patients, assuming she had potentially curable disease as early as possible. And the person who was going to make this happen was our Pink nurse. And what happens today is that the nurse will contact our patients as soon as possible after their breast cancer diagnosis, and as soon as it's appropriate, bring up the idea you're probably going to need chemo, for sure you'll need tamoxifen if you're ER positive, let's talk about fertility. And even for patients who are referred from outside because they've had their diagnosis and surgery at another center, before they even come to see us, the pink nurse will contact them by phone and, if appropriate, bring up the idea of fertility. And this is wonderful because by the time they see me as a medical oncologist, often they've already started their fertility preservation procedure or even completed. So there's no delay in initiating your chemotherapy in many of these cases. And we also have written brochures to give the patients because the decision making is very complex. As you can see, there are multiple procedures, each with their pros and cons, and this allows patients to start their decision making before they even see the fertility specialist. We also had special steps taken by the fertility center. They designated a specific fertility doctor to see all the cancer patients who would be familiar with the literature and the issues of these patients. They set up a hotline so we could fax referrals, and they agreed to see these patients within 48 hours of referral. And they also had a specific counselor appointed to help these women with their complex decision making. Because unlike other patients, in order to not delay treatment, things have, if you're in a certain part of your cycle, often you have to decide today that you're going to start tomorrow, which is very difficult. Support for patient and family. I've divided into individual, personalized support and group support, and many patients have a preference for one or the other. At our own institution, Sunnybrook, most of the support is done informally by the pink nurse, and the fact that this nurse meets the patients right after diagnosis and is a consistent follow-through person is amazing. And often, if you have a patient who's having trouble coping with the concept of getting chemotherapy, it's the pink nurse who already has a 2 or 3 month relationship with this patient who's able to convince the patient of the importance of it. And and the patients already trust the nurse. And often, I think, ultimately, that in itself makes the care much better. Not to mention being able to brief all the specialists about all the subtle things that the nurses learned about patients over time. For patients who need more formal counseling, there is the ability to refer them to our social work, psychology, or psychiatry services. And many of these individuals have a special interest in this age group. We also have a sexual health clinic, not nearly as elaborate as the one we heard about in Boston, but women with vaginal dryness, problems, etc. can be referred there. There are also some very interesting community supports we found out about. We have a peer support program, so a newly diagnosed woman is matched up with a similar-aged woman who's already completed treatment who can act as a coach and buddy to her. We also have a funded child life specialist who's an expert for little children who are having problems coping with their mother's illness. And she will go right into the home and help the child and the family cope better. And we also have a wonderful charity called Nanny Angel Network, which sends free childcare services to women who have financial resource problems, who can't afford a babysitter, that they need to go to treatments. We've initiated 3 novel group support programs, which I will talk about in a minute, at Sunnybrook. But there's also something in the community called Support Saturdays, where young families can drop into a lovely center downtown, and there's special programs for the women, for their husbands, who desperately need this stuff, and for their young children with the child life specialist. So in the pink is the most established group program that we have right now. It's been running for 2 years. It's a patient support group run by the pink nurse. They meet 1 evening per month. And it's on Sunnybrook campus, but it's outside of the cancer center, which is much more comfortable for the patients. And they can either attend regularly every month, or they can drop in whenever they want, once or less, or whatever. And we're now getting 6 to 9 patients per session, which is a perfect number according to our therapists who are experts in this. And one thing that we found is that it was the most difficult patients who are coming to these sessions. These are patients that are having the most trouble coping with their diagnosis, or patients who had those difficult sort of personalities which, can drive you crazy as a healthcare provider. And we thought if we put all these different patients in a room together, they'll kill each other, it'll be chaos. But in fact, it's been wonderful. Somehow they managed to get along and support each other, and it's been extremely therapeutic to them. Another session that we've recently put together is called Intimacy After Breast Cancer. It's modeled after a 2-day workshop designed by psychologist Dr. Sally Kidd, who's the author of a book called Intimacy After Cancer, which I recommend that you all read. And our patients don't have time to go to a 2-day workshop, so we've collapsed this into a 2-hour session, a bit ambitious. And it's led by our pink nurse, and she starts with a lecture, and she brings in props. Like we saw it before, and we saw vibrators and vaginal lubricants and dilators, so the patients can actually see what these things look like, how they're used, where to get them, and there's some discussion time for the patients. And we had our first session in August, well attended by 7 women, and we got excellent feedback. We're hoping to run this several times over the year. The most recent program we put together is called Out of the Blue, and it's an evening support group for the male partners of our patients. It's going to be run by the nurse and by the social worker. And the reason we came up with these ideas, we had many patients come to us and say, you know what, we're coping just fine, but our husbands are falling apart. You have to do something to them. And of course, men never admit they have problems. They don't like to talk about things and so forth. And actually, we even had a few brave men who approached us and asked for something. So we were very excited about starting it, and we were shocked when we announced the first planned session and only 1 brave man signed up. So we have to find some other ways to get these guys on board. We know they're there, we know there's a need, and we just have to get them to come in to declare themselves. So we'll keep trying. Education clearly starts with our patient information, but we have other goals. We definitely want to educate other healthcare professionals in training who may never be exposed to this group because we want them to get things right. And I have many residents and fellows now who rotate through my Monday morning peds clinics. Many are oncologists, but some are actually gynecologists, and that's really fun and they really enjoy it. We also had the privilege to have a pink fellow who came for 2 years. She was funded by her own country, Asma Ali. And she came to all the pink clinics, came to other breast cancer clinics, and she was able to complete and publish a 2-year research project on young women with breast cancer, which was great. We also want to educate cancer healthcare professionals who are out there in practice. And we do that with rounds, with invited lectures, and with publications. Ideally, we would also like to get out to family physicians and obstetricians in the community who still don't realize, some of them, that young women can get breast cancer and that a lump isn't necessarily a blocked milk duct after pregnancy. We'll get there. Another mandate that we theoretically should have is to educate young women out there in the public that they shouldn't be ignoring a breast lump, particularly if it's growing. But fortunately, there is a group in Canada called Team Shan, which does this extremely well. And research, that's my passion. Because what I would like to see is one day in the future where we don't need programs like PEAK, because young women hardly ever get breast cancer, and if you do, it can be guaranteed an excellent outcome. But we're not going to get there ever without research. And we have sort of a tri-pronged philosophy about research for PEAK. And the first thing is recognizing that most of the questions that you want to have answered are never going to be answered by one single institution who doesn't see that many of these patients. So we have to collaborate. And we're willing to collaborate with any institution who's asking a good question in this population. But we'd also like to be seen as leaders in the field, so we'd like to initiate our own studies and have other people collaborate with us. And we want to create a resource for future research. And what we've done is we've developed a prospective database of patient data, with psychosocial data, research, risk factors, family history. We're storing blood for DNA and serum, and we also wanted to collect tumor tissue. That was a political nightmare. But the idea is to have a resource that a future researcher could come back to and say, you know what, I have this new prognostic factor, but I need to have it validated. And then we'll be able to go back, look at our blood samples, look at our clinical data, look at our outcomes, and we can either, prove the hypothesis or negate it. So that's very exciting for us. We have many collaborative studies, and we're privileged to be working with the Harvard groups, helping ourselves, helping others. And one of the many interesting questions they're trying to ask is why women of certain ethnicities seem to have more aggressive tumor biology, particularly the younger women. And when they found out that Toronto was the most multi-ethnic city in the world, they were thrilled that we could add that element to their population. So we've been accruing to that. We just completed a study looking at specific factors that predict how toxic chemotherapy will be to the ovaries. We're collaborating with a very ambitious study looking at the long-term effects of chemotherapy in utero on brain function of children who were exposed to chemotherapy because their mothers were diagnosed with breast cancer during pregnancy, a very complex topic. And those patients tremendously benefit from PINK, by the way, because it's such a multidisciplinary problem. We're also looking at the safety of fertility preservation. As you heard, there's only one study in the literature, and we're trying to have the second study looking at whether ovarian stimulation with hormones, particularly in ER-positive patients, is safe. And you've heard about the positive study with which we'll be collaborating. We also have some studies that we've completed ourselves, and Asimismo, that pink fellow I told you about, she's published, as far as I know, the only study in the medical literature looking at the importance of these young women's mothers in supporting them and the unmet needs of these mothers. And one of our breast fellows is going to be presenting a poster at San Antonio this year on why almost 20% of our patients who are not high risk for contralateral breast cancer still choose to have bilateral prophylactic mastectomies. We have some very interesting ongoing studies, and the most interesting one is an online psychosocial intervention for young couples. And the PI on this is Dr. Karen Fergus, our PINK psychologist. And the rationale for this is that these young couples need counseling much more than their older counterparts, but they have much less time, and particularly the men are much less interested in traditional counseling. But they're very tech savvy, they love computers, and doing an online intervention would give them the flexibility, the comfort, and the convenience that they need. So the objectives of the study are to develop and test a web-based, internet-based program aiming to, first of all, educate these couples about the challenges associated with breast cancer at a young age and some strategies to deal with these challenges. To normalize their experience so they realize they're not the only ones going through this nightmare of sexual difficulties and child care issues, etc., that there are other young couples all going through exactly the same thing, and to help strengthen their relationship and their capacity for coping with all these issues. So the intervention takes approximately 8 weeks. It's a combination of educational things that the women and men can read, videos they can watch, and then there are interactive sessions where there are exercises that the woman and the man do separately and then together to help strengthen their coping as a couple. And what makes this unique is that there's a healthcare professional facilitator online who works with the couples. It's all completely confidential. Nobody knows what any other couples are doing. And this is all done through a dialogue room online. It's flexible. The couples can do this anytime it's convenient for them. They can stop and then pick it up again. And altogether, it only takes about 1 hour per week of their time, which is pretty much all they have. And this is what it looks like. This is how the couples sign in. So after pilot testing the initial website on about 20 couples, revisions were made based on the couples' feedback, and this is now a randomized trial being done across Canada. And we're very excited. We just applied for another grant to hopefully eventually, when the study is completed, be able to make this available to all women across Canada. And I think this could be adapted to Spanish, and something similar could be done anywhere probably. So we still have a lot of ongoing challenges. And the first one is, of course, our funding. We have to pay for our full-time nurse. We have to pay for a part-time research coordinator. Separating blood and freezing it costs money, and so forth. And we also have a wish list. We would love to be able to hire a part-time nurse because our full-time nurses really reach total capacity to handle patients. And it would be wonderful to be able to have a PINK fellow every year that we could fund. So where do we get our funds from? There are these large organized fundraising events which take a lot of time but are very lucrative. There's an organization called Identificar Breast Cancer, which especially focuses on young women with breast cancer and very generously funded us for a few years. And they run some of those programs I told you about, like the peer support program and the life specialist. Patients often do mini fundraisers, garage sales, runs where they get sponsored. It's lovely how much work they do for us. There are personal donations, and lately I've actually been getting older breast cancer patients in my practice who hear about the program and they feel so sorry for the plight of these younger women that they're happy to leave money in their estates after they die for these women. It's very touching but very needed. We also have very limited resources in terms of our manpower. And in order to allow us to enroll new patients in this program, we're going to have patients graduate. So we've come up with criteria. Basically, patients have to be at least 5 years from diagnosis, doing well psychologically and physically, and not need any special procedures that we can only offer at our cancer center. So we give the patients some notice, and we don't want to lose track of them, particularly for research projects. So we will have a questionnaire at discharge and then annually, basically focusing on various quality of life issues and also their disease status. And finally, most importantly, are we meeting our goals? Like, we'd like to think we are, but we need to have some objective measure. And one of the best ways is to ask our patients. So we decided to survey our patients. And we came up with a number of goals for the survey. We want to know, are we really having fertility discussion rates? Are we having a fertility discussion with all the patients? Are the patients satisfied with the supports and information they're getting? What do they think about the research we're doing? How do they feel about graduating from PEAK? And what can they suggest for us to improve the program? So we developed an anonymous online survey. It was a mixture of multiple choice and open-ended items. And we sent the patients a letter of invitation and a link to the survey. We could only send it to patients who had given us their email addresses, so a little bit of bias there. But they had to complete it after treatment. And we sent them this notice again and again, trying to maximize our response rate. And we got a 50% response rate, a little higher, which is considered extremely good for this type of questionnaire where there's no real incentive for the patient to complete it. And the patients were highly educated, average age just over 35, most married with children. And they were similar in demographics to our PEAK patients as a whole. So our first question was fertility, and we were very interested in this because someone called Samantha Yee had just done a survey of young breast cancer patients across Canada to see how many had a fertility discussion initiated by a healthcare provider. And the rate was dismal. It was only 25%. And only half of those patients were getting referred for fertility preservation. So we were thrilled. 93% of our patients recalled having such a discussion. And most of the rest weren't sure. They didn't say they hadn't had it. And 2/3 were offered referral to a fertility clinic. So we're very proud of that. The patients were very satisfied with the information they were getting. And they were very satisfied with the support they were getting from the PEAK nurse. And about 1/3 had actually attended at least one session of the group in the PEAK. And this is just a quote from one of the patients telling us how wonderful this program is. It was interesting. Patients have very different attitudes to graduating from PEAK. About 1/3 of them were thrilled at the idea that they would be healthy enough to be able to leave the cancer center and put breast cancer behind them. On the other hand, there were about 1/3 who were terrified at the idea of leaving the close and careful follow-up and attention that they were getting. They didn't think they would get nearly as good service from their family doctor. And if the other three really didn't care one way or the other. It seemed like 6 months' notice was approximately the optimal amount of time to give them. So far this all sounds great, we're doing amazing. Well, not so fast. Research was where we really fell down. Only 50% of the patients knew about any specific research studies that PEAK was doing. And those who had participated in studies seemed to be upset that they'd never gotten the results of their studies. And they also wanted research that would help them now, not just patients in the future. And then the rest of the patients weren't sure what studies were available. So there are also several suggestions for improvement, some of which we can address and some of which we can't. They told us not to change our PEAK nurse again. Well, we certainly hope we won't have to. They want us to advertise them to other hospitals in Toronto so that women who aren't diagnosed at our institution can take advantage of PEAK. And we tried doing that at the beginning, and we can do a better job of that. They want us to advertise our PEAK website. Well, first we have to make sure the website deserves to be advertised, so we're going to work on that. They want to see more young women in the waiting room. Well, we tried to do that. Our colleagues refused to cooperate. That's like, maybe if a big donor wants to designate a pink waiting room, you could have them all in that room. That was, you know, whoever happens to be in that particular clinic. Oops, I don't know how that happened. Sorry about that. A lot of women said they would love to come to sessions like in the Pink, but they live too far away and they don't want to come across the city in the evening again. And they would love to have supports closer to their homes. Well, we would love that too, and that's a money issue. What patients did request is they wanted more information about diet and nutrition, and we're going to definitely address that. We're going to start putting out a monthly newsletter about diet and exercise tips for patients, and also have some sessions for them with diet and exercise demonstrations. And donors wanted an annual update on what their money was being used for. And based on all this, we thought it would be great to put together an evening session. And we held this a few weeks ago, where we could invite our families, our patients, and donors, and give them an update on what we were doing. And we invited 2 of our patients to speak. We spoke about the research and so forth, gave an update on the survey. And unfortunately, attendance was really disappointing. I guess these people are just so busy. And that was despite having refreshments for them. But we're going to type out a transcript of what we discussed. We're going to email it to all the donors and patients we invited, and hopefully that will at least be useful. And maybe we'll try again in another year or 2. And finally, I just want to say sometimes it's very frustrating, you know, how limited we are with Pink. I think that every single young woman with breast cancer deserves to be in a Pink-like program. And that's why I was absolutely thrilled when Dr. Cynthia Villarreal asked me to come to this session and help her get her program going for young women, because I think that's exactly what people should be doing everywhere. And you know, I would love, it's a fantastic initiative, and I would love to be able to help in any way. We would also like to make our research more broad-based and far-reaching for younger women. And that's why I'm really excited about this new grant that we've just gotten. It's $6 million over 5 years. And what we're going to be doing is collecting 1,200 newly diagnosed breast cancer patients aged 40 or younger at 28 centers across Canada over 4 years. We're going to collect clinical information, lifestyle factors, family history, stored tumor tissue, and blood. And that's going to be a future legacy that other researchers can access for all sorts of research questions. People all over the world can apply for this. We're also going to have some immediate research studies. We're going to look at some novel genes that may be implicated in breast cancer risk. We're also going to look at the correlation between lifestyle factors like diet and exercise and risk of recurrence. We have some experts on the team looking at that. And also, I'm privileged to be in charge of 2 fertility studies. One is going to be training surgical oncologists across Canada to talk about fertility issues with their patients, even briefly, and get them referred early for fertility preservation if appropriate. And my second study is I want to try to develop some sort of normogram to predict beyond age alone which women don't really need to go for expensive and complicated fertility preservation procedures, and which patients may do very nicely with LHRH protection or nothing at all, and save them that. And as a spin-off of that, we could perhaps predict which women are going to go into permanent menopause or not, and so forth. So for that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I don't know if there's a question, if you want to ask any questions, but thank you.
Muchas gracias, doctora Warner. Me informan que no tenemos preguntas tiempo para preguntas, y además la doctora tiene que así que